Welcome to today's program. I'm at the NRB convention in Nashville, Tennessee, with a man who is actually not a country singer, but a very well-known preacher, R.T. Kendall. And R.T., thank you for being on the program.
Well, Dan, you honor me, and you might like to know that some of the best-known country music singers are my friends. Although, to be honest, I'm more of a Rachmaninoff, Tchaikovsky, Mozart man.
Well, for those of you who loved the work of Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, R.T. actually took over the church there for 25 years, I think?
25 years to the day.
Wow. And he's now sort of in semi-retirement, busier than ever. And first of all, tell us, you've just been to the Middle East, is it?
Yeah, well, I just got back this week from Dubai and Qatar and India. I actually was my first trip to India. And so God has been very good to me. At the age of 77, I'm literally the busiest I've ever been in my whole life.
Wow. Now, tell me exactly, are there local Christians, or were these the expats?
Okay, expats in Dubai and Qatar, but local Christians in New Delhi.
Yes, yeah. Wow. Now, you have written how many books now?
Well, I asked John Stott once, I said, how many books have you written, John? He said, that's like the sin of David numbering the people. But you see, to show you how unspiritual I am, I do know the answer. If I were really spiritual, I wouldn't know. But I think about 60.
Wow. Now, this is called These Are the Days of Elijah.
Yes.
And now, tell me why Elijah?
Well, my last series of sermons at Westminster Chapel was doing Elijah from 1 Kings and 2 Kings. And I think that lasted about 3 or 4 months. And so we typed them up and edited them so that they would read fairly well. And the publisher had asked for these. And then we had to decide what to call it. I said, we'll call it Elijah. I guess that's pompous of me to think that they would take it with Elijah. I've done a book, Jonah, with R.T. Kendall, Jonah. I thought they'd do that with Elijah. They said that won't sell. Well, humbling, but I accepted that. And they wanted to call it These Are the Days of Elijah, which is based upon that well-known chorus hymn written by that lovely man in Northern Ireland, These Are the Days of Elijah. Anyway, that is the title. And so because I happen to know him, I'd just been in a conference with him, I wrote him and said, look, my publisher wants to call the book These Are the Days of Elijah. How do you feel about it? Oh, he was thrilled and has written the foreword to it. So isn't that nice? It worked out very well.
Now, why Elijah? What interested you about his life?
Well, first of all, why the series of sermons on Elijah? Because that's what they were based upon. And the answer is, when you're in the same pulpit for 25 years, you have to look for what to preach on next. I mean, I've gone through the life of David, Joseph, Jacob, and I wanted to do a book on Elijah, or a series of sermons on Elijah. When I wrote Jonah, people said, why did you choose Jonah? That was my first series at Westminster Chapel. First series, and my first book was Jonah. And now my last series is Elijah. Well, they all asked, why did you choose Jonah? And the reply I gave was, I am Jonah. I can identify with Jonah every part of his life, from the time that he was running from God, swallowed up in the belly of the fish, and then when he's pouting and sulking, when he doesn't get his way. Now, Elijah, would you believe this, Dan? I identify with him. I identify with him. Wait, not his anointing. I don't have that. Not his spectacular power calling fire down from heaven. No, I don't mean that. I'm talking about the man. You see, James chapter 5 verse 7 says Elijah was just like us. And I'll tell you something. That is absolutely true. and you look at his life in detail, I can tell you, he was an ordinary man. He was an obedient man. He was an ordinary man. And the more I got into Elijah, the more I was convinced if God could use Elijah, he could use me. And I would add, if he can use me, he can use anybody. And so the book is written to show that God will use ordinary people to do extraordinary things.
Yeah.
These are the days of Elijah.
Can you sort of set a picture for Elijah, his background, and what was it that you were fascinated with?
Oh, well, first of all, we don't know anything about him. That's the funny thing. He comes out of the blue. Chapter 1.
Yeah.
Chapter 1 in his book. Out of the blue. He just shows up.
Yeah.
He's called Elisha the Tishbite. And the next thing we know is that he goes to King Ahab and says, "It will not rain until I say so." Now that's a pretty bold thing to say.
Yeah.
And of course that doesn't bless the king.
Yeah.
But when it stopped raining, then the king wants to see Elijah. He starts looking for him.
Yeah.
And Elijah is now on the run because he's in serious trouble.
Yeah.
And the king blames Elijah for the famine that was in the land. But the first thing I deal with after the chapter Out of the Blue, how dare Elijah say to the king, it won't rain until I say so. How could he do it? And I go into a study that I think is very, very neglected.
Yeah.
Dan, have you ever heard of the difference between an oath and the promise, or the promise and the oath? In Hebrews chapter 6, verse 18, the writer talks about two immutable things, two unchangeable things. People don't know what those two things are. I can tell you. Promise and oath. Promise and oath. Now, when God gives a promise, it is almost always on condition.
Yeah.
You find the word if. I will do such and such if.
Yeah.
Or take John 3:16, the Bible in a nutshell, according to Martin Luther. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish. But it's on a condition that if you believe, you won't perish.
Yeah.
So that's a promise.
Okay.
Promises of God are based upon a condition that we will do certain things.
Yeah.
The oath, no conditions. If God swears an oath, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
Like it or not, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
All right. Sometimes God swears an oath to us. He did to Abraham. When he swore the oath to Abraham, Abraham knew that his seed would be as the sand of the sea. Until then, he wasn't so sure. He believed it, but he doubted. He believed it, but he doubted. But one day God swore an oath to Abraham, and he knew it was coming.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is this, Dan. If God ever swears an oath to you, you know it's going to happen, and you know you haven't been deceived.
Right.
And it's probably the greatest thing that can happen to a human being is for God to swear an oath to you. Well, obviously, that had happened with Elijah.
Yeah.
Because he comes to the king and says, as God lives, see, that's oath language.
Yeah.
As God lives, there will be neither dew nor rain unless I say it can rain.
Yeah.
And then you see that Elijah's operating under the same kind of anointing. Here he is on Mount Carmel. He challenges the prophets of Baal. And he says, if God be God, serve him. If Baal be God, serve him.
Yeah.
And we make a deal. And the deal is that the God who answers by fire is the true God. And so they all agree to that. They all agree to that, which was a big mistake on their part. Well, they go first, and they say, "Oh, Baal, hear us.
Yeah.
Oh, Baal, hear us." And about this time, Elijah starts to have a party.
Yeah.
He has the time of his life. He pokes fun at them. He said, shout a little louder. Maybe he's deaf. Maybe he's hard of hearing. Maybe he's traveling. And the question I ask, how could Elijah be so confident and be so sure and be so calm? you would think he'd have a nervous breakdown. He thinks to himself, oh, what's going to happen when it's my turn and I say, God, come with your fire?
Yeah.
But you know how Elijah could be so calm? God had sworn an oath to him. And so, Dan, I deal with this in my book, These Are the Days of Elijah. It is one of the most neglected theological themes ever.
Yeah.
Ever.
Oh.
And the epistle to the Hebrews was actually written partly to encourage people to trust God, that one day he'd swear an oath to them.
Yeah.
You see, if God swears an oath to you, for example, it can refer to answered prayer.
Yeah.
You know, John said, if we know that he hears us, we know we have it.
Sure.
But knowing that, how do you know?
Yeah.
Or Jesus said, if you have the faith of God, believe that you have received it, and you will have it. Well, how can you have that? It's when God swears an oath.
Yeah.
And so it's when, as you pray, you know your prayer will be answered. Or it's in the area of assurance. There are people who don't know whether they're saved or lost. Or they base their salvation on their good works, and they think, today I think I'm saved. I'm not sure I will be tomorrow.
Yes, yeah.
If God ever swears an oath to you, you never doubt your salvation.
Sure.
In other words, maybe I've said more about this than you wanted to know.
No, I don't.
But that's what the book is about in part. But then it focuses on Elijah, the human being. He was so human.
Now tell us a little bit about his background, because as you mentioned, he suddenly appears from nowhere. Where was he living, and what was the sort of situation there?
That's the point. We don't know. We don't know. He's simply called Elijah the Tishbite. And it goes to show that God can use people if they don't have a background, if they don't have a pedigree.
Yeah.
There are those who say, well, I can't get a job. I don't have references.
Yeah.
I don't have this person to recommend me. Who did Elijah have? He just comes in out of the blue, says to Ahab, it won't rain unless I say so.
Yeah.
And I think the point here is that if one has an anointing that's really from God, and it's something you're not making up, if you've really got it, it doesn't matter what your background is.
Sure.
God will use that to get the attention of the kings of this world, because they want to listen to you when you speak with authority. So we don't know anything about his background.
Yeah.
Anything.
Now, when you get to heaven, you're going to be able to meet some of these guys. What would you say to Elijah? What sort of questions would you like to ask him?
Well, first I think I would say, Elijah, did you read my book? And which is not.
Well, if he didn't, what would you say?
Well, I would say, Elijah, I've said things in the book. I'd love to know whether I really got it right. And but for example, think of him going to this widow in Zarephath, who is out of food, got no bread, no oil, and Elijah goes up to her and says, I'm hungry, I want you to feed me. And she looks at him and says, how dare you talk to me like that? Says, I've got food just for the day, and then we both die. My son and I, we die. You know what Elijah does? He says, I want you to feed me and feed me first.
Oh, no.
Feed me and feed me first. Such cheek, such boldness, such impertinence. And I want to say to Elijah, didn't that embarrass you a little bit? to go up to this poor widow and say, I not only want you to feed me, but feed me first, and then you can feed yourself. But you know what? For some reason, she did it. And they never ran out of food. It just was multiplied, like later when Jesus multiplied the loaves and the fish. That's what happened there.
And what about Jonah? What would you like to ask him?
Jonah? Well, let's see. Go up to Jonah and say, Jonah, I say in my book about you that you finally learned your lesson. And would you agree that you finally learned your lesson, or is it true that you continue to sulk and pout because you didn't get your way? But I think he learned his lesson, because in writing up the book, Jonah, he let God have the last word. And that's a pretty good sign that we've learned our lesson.
Now, for people who are going to get these books, you probably would be interested to know the rather extraordinary situation that R.T. Kendall found himself in. Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones was probably one of the most well-known, respected preachers in Britain. He was a rather small gentleman, Welsh, a surgeon, I understand. So how on earth did you take over, and how did that come about?
Well, it's called God's sense of humor. I come from the hills of Kentucky. But Dr. Lloyd-Jones, for some reason, liked me. God gave me favor with him. What people don't know is that I met him first in Winona Lake, Indiana, and he autographed my book, Sermon on the Mount, and then I started writing him letters, and he would always write me back, and I'd ask him questions. He always would answer. He was so gracious. And then I never dreamed the day would come, but it did.
Just out of interrupt there, were they handwritten letters that he sent you or typed?
I've got one handwritten letter from him. They were always typed.
Yeah.
And he always signed the D.M. Lloyd-Jones. D.M. Lloyd-Jones.
Yeah.
John Stott told me he's got a bunch of letters, and they all are signed D.M. Lloyd-Jones. That was it. That was it. But what happened was that years later, to my surprise, I was invited to study at Oxford University. And so I let him know I'm coming to England. And our friendship, takes off. And he visited us several times in our home in Oxford. We even went to Shakespeare plays together. And we became like father and son. One day, somebody calls Dr. Lloyd-Jones, he's the secretary from Westminster Chapel, and said, "We've been told we should have an R.T. Kendall. What do you say? Do you know him?" Oh, theologian, but have him. Those were his very words. Theologian, but have him. Well, it was only going to be for one day, and I preached. Lo and behold, at the end of the day, the 12 deacons came into the vestry and asked me to stay. And I stayed 25 years.
Now, did they interrogate you, or how did it all work out?
Well, good question. No, they never asked me a single question, and I wonder why. But they didn't. I need to tell you this. When they asked me to stay, they asked me to stay for 6 months.
Okay.
And I said, I don't know. We're ready to go back to America. I've packed our books, my son's new bicycle, souvenirs, because I was ready to go back. I had just finished my thesis at Oxford. And Doctor himself and Mrs. Lloyd-Jones drove to see us and says, "Please stay 6 months. You've got nothing to lose." I said, well, if they do want me, I'm not going to stay, and I don't think that would be very nice to let them put me up in a nice flat for 6 months. It's going to cost them money, and I'd feel guilty if I didn't stay. He said, "Don't worry. I can assure you, you don't need to worry about that." Well, we agreed to stay for 6 months. So the point is, in answer to your question, although they didn't ask me any questions, they heard me preach 3 times a week for the next 6 months, and they got to know me. And of course, they felt very comfortable knowing the doctor knew me. As a matter of fact, he came to hear me, and I didn't know he was there. He called me on the phone, and he said, "You're a preacher. You're a born preacher. Your place is not in a seminary or university. Your place is in the pulpit." And he told that to everybody and said, "There's your man." And everybody knew the doctor liked me. And the deacons were at ease, and he's the one that put me there. In fact, I quote him years later. I said, "Doctor, you're not the one that first mentioned me. It was somebody else." And he says, "Listen to me. I and I alone put you there." Well, that's true. That's true. But it wasn't him. It wasn't he who initially initiated it, because he always saw me as an academic, as a theologian. But then when he heard me preach, he said, "You're a preacher." Wow. So they ended up calling me. And, well, after about 2 or 3 months, what happened was people began to be converted. And people were excited. I should point out something.
Yeah.
I did not follow Dr. Lloyd Jones. There was another man that followed him.
Oh.
He was there 5 years.
Yeah.
And then they were without a minister for 3 years.
Okay.
That's when they had me.
I see.
That's when they had me.
Now, can you set the scene for people who maybe don't realize the amazing location this church was? Tell me some of the buildings around you.
Well, you could hear Big Ben. Just a 4-minute walk, or 3 minutes, was Buckingham Palace.
Yeah.
And so you've got the Houses of Parliament, you've got Buckingham Palace, and you're right there in the center of everything. And I don't think even I perceived what it was like to be there.
Yeah.
I remember something Doctor told me after he retired. His words were, "I can hardly remember being there." He was there 30 years. He said, "I can hardly remember being there."
Yeah.
I was there 25 years.
Yeah.
And I could say, I can hardly remember being there. And I had to pinch myself every time I walked up into the pulpit.
Yeah.
I never felt it was my church. I thought it was his.
Yeah.
And but he was probably the greatest preacher, not only of the 20th century,
Yeah.
but arguably
Yeah.
the greatest preacher that ever lived.
Huh.
And here I am from Kentucky going in and following that.
Yeah.
And it was, those were the best of times, but the worst of times.
I heard a wonderfully funny story about Dr. Lloyd Jones. A young man called Christopher Catherwood was a friend of mine.
I know him. He's Sir Fred's son.
Yes,
and that Christopher is Dr. Lloyd Jones' grandson.
Yes, and he edited many of those books. There's Joy Unspeakable, and he told me that Dr. Lloyd Jones had one vice. He loved wrestling, and he said he would have his grandkids on his lap, and he would go berserk, cheering and shouting. And did you ever see that side of him?
Oh yeah. I could tell you a lot. I could write his biography. I could write a book on the Doctor and I. It would be a bestseller. I'm not sure that is something I will ever do. I can tell you that it's something I will never do. But I knew Christopher. He edited my book called God Meant It for Good. One of my early, about my 10th or 15th book was God Meant It for Good, based on the life of Joseph.
Yeah.
And Christopher was the editor.
How wonderful.
Yeah. But I know about Dr. loving wrestling. I don't know that he'd be very happy if Christopher told that.
Yeah.
I think it was one of the secrets he wanted to keep. But now it's out, so what can I say?
Yeah, he liked a wrestler called Big Daddy, who was a big, tall guy he used to wear the Union Jack flag on his outfit. You know.
Well, you're telling things that will get Christopher to take the blame for that.
Yeah, well, I've written it up as a story. So, looking back on your life, and do you have to pinch yourself?
Every day.
Yeah.
Every day, Dan. Who am I to have been in that pulpit? It was such an honor.
Yeah.
And, of course, the books that I've written would never have been written had I not been there.
Yes.
It's not that I'm that good.
Yeah.
It's because I was at Westminster Chapel. That's why people are interested in me.
Wow. So, did the people translate? Did somebody translate these sermons and then you knocked them into shape?
Well, what you do, you get a typist who types every word.
Okay.
Every word.
Huh.
The oohs and the ahs, and then you go through it and put in full stops.
Yeah.
That means period. And commas, and start new sentences.
Yeah.
And then you go over the third time.
Yeah.
And finally, it's ready to submit to the publisher, and then the publisher comes back with criticisms.
Yeah.
And they're always good, always right.
Sure.
And so my book on Elijah is a typical one.
Yeah.
These are sermons that made into a book, but when you read it, you wouldn't know it's a sermon.
Yeah, yeah.
You wouldn't know it's a sermon. And what I want to do is to show Elijah was so human. You know what, Dan? He took himself so seriously. Mm-hmm. He said, "I alone am left. Imagine saying that at the top of Mount Carmel. I alone am left. God could have in that moment say, stop, you're wrong, you're not the only one.
Yeah.
There's Obadiah who hid 100 prophets in a cave.
Yeah.
How dare you say that?
Yeah.
But that was Elijah, proud man, fearful man, but I love him.
Oh, that's great. Well, we've been speaking to the one and only R.T. Kendall, an extraordinary man who goes from the hills of Kentucky to one of the most amazing places on earth, the city of Westminster in London, and he still hasn't retired. He ought to be retiring by now, because I think he's even older than me. But anyway, I just want to say thank you so much for being on the program.
You honor me, Dan. God bless you.
Thank you.